The morning sun painted the sky in soft strokes of pink and gold as she cradled her coffee mug, standing on the creaking wooden porch of the house that had been her family for over 100 years. This wasn't just a house. It was a living, breathing memory of the people who had built it with their hands, their sweat, and their love. Every brick in its foundation told a story, from her grandfather's labor during the Great Depression to her mother's stubborn insistence on keeping the intricate, hand-carved porch railing intact despite the passage of time. The scent of heirloom roses, planted decades ago by her grandmother, drifted through the cool morning air, weaving a fragrance of nostalgia that wrapped around her heart. She wasn't just standing on wood and nails. She was standing on history, on love, on legacy. And yet, that legacy had become a thorn in the side of the people who now surrounded her. Over the years, the quiet neighborhood had changed, not with the slow grace of time, but with the aggressive push of newcomers who wanted everything in neat, uniform rows, matching fences, beige walls, and a silent compliance to rules no one had agreed to. Her home, with its bold colors and unapologetic uniqueness, was an offense to their forced perfection, and they would stop at nothing to erase it. The first letter arrived in a thick, glossy envelope, the kind that screamed importance. She didn't even need to open it to know what it contained. She had seen the way her neighbors had been approached one by one, some giving in without a fight, others vanishing in quiet surrender as their homes were gutted, repainted, stripped of their history. The letter, as expected, was an invitation to join the newly formed Homeowners Association. The word invitation carried the same weight as a veiled threat. Inside, a list of changes was outlined in crisp, impersonal ink. Her historic shutters would have to go, the hand-painted trim would need to be repainted in an HOA-approved color, and her grandmother's rose garden was not in alignment with the community's aesthetic. But it was a final line that made her hands shake. Failure to comply could result in necessary enforcement actions to maintain neighborhood standards. She had seen this before. It started with letters, then warnings. Then came the fines, the complaints, the relentless pressure until people had no choice but to leave. But she wasn't just anyone. She wasn't someone who bowed to pressure. This was her home, her family's legacy, and no committee of power-hungry suburban tyrants was going to take that from her. At first, it was subtle, a crack in the sidewalk she knew hadn't been there before. The garbage truck somehow forgetting to pick up her trash, leaving her bags piled high for days. The sudden influx of complaints. Her grass was an inch too long. Her shutters were too bright. Her mailbox wasn't up to community standards. Neighbors she had once waved and now hurried past her house without making eye contact, whispering among themselves like children afraid of being caught out of line. The HOA president, a woman with a smile that never reached her eyes, stopped her during one of her morning walks, her voice dripping with manufactured politeness. "I know change is hard, dear," she had said, her manicured nails tapping against her clipboard. "But we all have to make sacrifices for the good of the community." Sacrifices, as if her family's history was something to be burned in the name of progress. But progress, she realized, was never about making things better for everyone. It was about control, about power. And the HOA wanted to control every inch of this neighborhood, down to the color of the flowers in her yard. She had seen these tactics before. This wasn't just about property values. This was about breaking people down, making them question their own worth, their own right to exist in a place they had every legal right to call home. But she wasn't so easily broken. The night the rose garden was destroyed, she knew the game had changed. It was late when she heard the rustling outside her window, the unmistakable sound of movement where there should have been none. By the time she got outside, the damage was already done. The air was thick with the acrid scent of chemicals, the leaves of her grandmother's roses curling inward like fists clenched in pain. What had once been vibrant and full of life now lay in wilted, dying piles along the garden bed. A note was pinned to her fence with nail, bold, impersonal, final. Non-compliance will not be tolerated. Her hands trembled as she traced the jagged edges of the paper. This wasn't an accident. This was a message. The HOA wasn't just trying to pressure her. They were trying to break her, to make her feel powerless, isolated. But they had underestimated her. She had spent her life fighting bullies in the courtroom, She had put corrupt men behind bars, torn down systems built on lies, and exposed those who thrived in the shadows. If they thought a few poison flowers would scare her into submission, they had no idea who they were dealing with. This was war now, and she had spent her entire life preparing for battles just like this. She didn't cry over the roses. She didn't break down under the weight of their intimidation. Instead, she spent the next day documenting everything. She took photos, gathered soil samples, and reached out to old contacts who knew how to follow money trails. If the HOA thought she would fold, they were about to learn just how deeply she understood the law. She pulled property records, real estate transactions, and past complaints filed by previous homeowners. Patterns began to emerge. Mysterious fires, sudden sales, families forced out of homes they had lived in for decades. The HOA wasn't about neighborhood beautification. It was a front for something much bigger, something more sinister. She could feel it in her bones. This wasn't just about her house. This was about control, about power, about money. And if there was one thing she knew about people who thrived on control, it was that they always left behind evidence of their greed. They always thought they were untouchable, until someone braver, smarter, and more relentless came along to tear them down. She wasn't just going to fight back. She was going to bring the entire system crashing down around them. In the dead of night, when the world seemed to hold its breath and even the whisper of the wind was subdued, she was jolted from her uneasy sleep by an eerie disturbance outside. With the moon hanging low and pale above the silent street, she ventured onto her dew-laden lawn, only to discover that the heart of her cherished rose garden, her grandmother's lifelong labor of love, had been mercilessly tampered with. The once vibrant blossoms, each petal a burst of color and memory, now lay ravaged and discolored, their beauty marred by a sinister chemical agent. Every leaf, every thorn, screamed of a deliberate act of sabotage. No careless vandalism, but cold, calculated strike meant to send a message. In that heart-wrenching moment, as she knelt among the ruins of what had been a living testament to generations of hope and passion, an avalanche of emotions crashed over her. Anger, despair, and an unyielding resolve surged through her veins. She realized that this wasn't merely an attack on her garden. It was an assault on her legacy, a deliberate attempt to force her to bend under the weight of conformity. Each withered rose was a scar, a painful reminder that the forces of modernity and control were prepared to extinguish the vibrancy of individual history. And yet, even as the poison seeped into the soil of her memories, a spark of defiance ignited within her, determined to document every drop of evidence. Every color that had once shone so brilliantly now reduced to a somber shade of loss. She vowed that this act of cruelty would be the catalyst for her stand. This calculated destruction, executed with chilling precision, had not only violated the sanctity of her home, but had also marked the beginning of a war against a system that sought to erase the stories woven into every brick and bloom. With trembling hands and a resolute heart, she promised herself that every injustice, every act of malice, will be met with an unyielding quest for justice. As the night deepened, so did her determination. From this deliberate act of ruin would arise a battle for dignity, legacy, and the preservation of what made her home a true sanctuary of memory and love. Just as the first rays of dawn crept over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of hopeful pink and gold, a nightmare unfolded that no one could have foreseen. While the neighborhood stirred with the promise of a new day, a chilling roar shattered the calm. A roar that heralded the onset of calamity. Far away from the quiet comfort of her usual morning routine, she received the heart-stopping news. Her home, the repository of decades of love and history, was ablaze. Thick, acrid smoke billowed into the sky, blotting out the soft light and replacing it with menacing, swirling darkness. In that terrifying moment, the reality of her loss crashed down like a tidal wave. Amidst the chaos and confusion, she struggled to process the devastation. Every memory etched in the very walls of that home seemed to disintegrate in the fiery onslaught. Even as neighbors gathered in shock and whispered in disbelief, her heart sank with the weight of betrayal. Not only had her haven been destroyed by flames, but the cold, calculated machinations behind the attack now made themselves brutally apparent. From a distance, she caught sight of a figure, unmistakably the smug face of the HOA president, casually sipping her morning coffee as if the conflagration were nothing more than a tragic accident. The juxtaposition was jarring. The serene ritual of a sunrise contrasted with the ravages of meticulously orchestrated disaster. In that instant, every memory of joyful family gatherings, every laugh shared on that cherished porch, was reduced to a pile of smoldering ash. And yet, even as despair threatened to overwhelm her, a fierce inner fire was kindled, a determination not to let this tragedy define her, but to use it as a rallying cry against a corrupt system that had turned her sanctuary into a battleground. The nightmare was real, its brutal reality etched into the charred remains of her past, but it also served as a catalyst. It would push her to confront not only the perpetrators, but the very culture of unchecked power and conformity that had allowed such devastation to take root. In the midst of the fiery chaos, the lesson was clear. When darkness descends, sometimes the only way to reclaim the light is to stand resolutely in its path and demand that justice be served. In the aftermath of the conflagration, when the flames had finally given way to the cold, sorrowful embers of a once vibrant home, she found herself sifting through the wreckage not only for remnants of cherished memories, but for clues that might reveal the truth behind the arson. Amid the twisted metal, shattered glass, and charred wood, small, almost inconspicuous details began to emerge. Details that whispered of deliberate tampering and premeditated malice. The security cameras that once dutifully recorded every moment of her daily life had mysteriously stopped functioning hours before the fire erupted, their screens ominously blank, as if the very act of recording had been interrupted by a nefarious hand. Dusty shards of paper, fragments of letters that had once carried threats and warnings, were scattered among the debris, each one a silent testament to the calculated cruelty of those who had sought to erase her legacy. As she carefully pieced together the evidence, her grief gave way to a cold, steely resolve. Every broken piece of glass and every singed photograph was meticulously documented, each one contributing to a growing tapestry of proof that the arson was no accident but the culmination of a sinister campaign of intimidation and control. With each discovery, the scope of conspiracy widened, revealing hints of larger forces at play, shadowy figures who moved through the darkness with a singular purpose: to obliterate the spirit of resistance in those who dare to hold onto their individuality. The ashes became not just the remains of a home, but a cryptic ledger chronicling the lengths to which power-hungry forces would go to enforce conformity. And as she combed through the remnants, the painful realization set in that her suffering was not an isolated incident, but part of a recurring pattern of targeted destruction aimed at those who refused to succumb to oppressive standards. In that somber silence, surrounded by the debris of her past, she gathered the fragment of evidence like pieces of a puzzle, each one a critical step toward unveiling the truth and exposing the corrupt network that had turned her sanctuary into a battleground for control and greed. As the investigation unfolded, the grim tapestry of corruption that had long plagued the neighborhood began to reveal itself in stark detail. What initially appeared to be isolated acts of vandalism and intimidation transformed into a sprawling network of greed, deception, and exploitation, a meticulously orchestrated scheme designed to strip away the individuality of every homeowner who dared to resist. She dug through old records, dusty ledgers, and faded newspaper clippings, uncovering a disturbing pattern that spanned years and even counties. Each case bore the unmistakable signature of the HOA's ruthless agenda. Homes that once stood proudly as bastions of history and community were suddenly abandoned, left succumb to mysterious accidents that conveniently paved the way for undervalued property sales. Rumors swirled like autumn leaves in the wind, whispered accounts of families forced from their homes after relentless harassment, of neighborhoods transformed overnight into uniform landscapes devoid of character. The evidence, painstakingly compiled from interviews with former residents and long-forgotten municipal reports, painted a damning picture. The HOA, under the guise of protecting property values and maintaining community standards, was in fact a front for a sinister alliance, a coalition of unscrupulous developers, crooked officials, and even members of law enforcement who turned a blind eye in exchange for a piece of the lucrative profits. Every step she took into the depths of this conspiracy only steeled her resolve further. The more she uncovered, the more it became apparent that her fight was not just for her own home, but for the soul of an entire community, where history was being sacrificed on the altar of profit. This network of greed and corruption was insidious, preying on the vulnerabilities of those who cherished tradition over trend, who valued legacy over the cold, impersonal dictates of a profit-driven machine. And yet, Within this dark web of deceit, she found a glimmer of hope, a community of brave souls who had also suffered under this regime and who were ready to stand with her against the tide of exploitation. Every piece of evidence, every heart-wrenching testimony from a displaced neighbor, was a rallying cry for justice, urging her to push forward and dismantle the empire of corruption brick by brick. Armed with the weight of irrefutable evidence and the fiery passion of a lifetime spent battling injustice, she transformed her personal tragedy into a crusade for truth. With the precision of a seasoned legal mind and the relentless determination of a warrior, she set about turning the tables on those who had thought themselves untouchable. Every document she unearthed, every recorded conversation, was carefully cataloged and scrutinized. Late nights were spent poring over reams of property records and financial statements, cross-referencing dates and signatures, until a pattern emerged that could not be ignored. Her courtroom experience, forged over decades of standing up to bullies and crooked officials, lent her both a strategic insight and unyielding resolve needed to take on an adversary as formidable as the corrupt HOA. In the quiet solitude of her study, surrounded by the faded photographs and relics of a bygone era, she methodically built her case. Each piece of evidence was a weapon in her arsenal, meticulously chosen and positioned to dismantle a facade of respectability that the HOA had so carefully constructed. Yet, even as she delved deeper into the labyrinth of deceit, her mind never wavered from the truth that had driven her from the start. That justice was not a privilege reserved for the powerful, but a right that belonged to every individual who dared uphold the values of integrity and tradition. With every fact laid bare, she embraced her dual identity, a respected judge and an unbreakable guardian of her community's legacy. The juxtaposition of her refined courtroom demeanor with the fierce determination of a warrior ready for battle became the embodiment of her fight. Her inner strength was a beacon for others who had suffered in silence, a testament to the power of standing up for what is right, no matter the cost. And as the gears of justice began to turn, she knew that her unwavering resolve would not only expose the rot at the core of the HOA, but would also inspire a new era of accountability and pride among those who had long been oppressed by the relentless march of greed. In the final stages of her relentless pursuit, the layers of deception peeled away to reveal a truth more shocking than any she had imagined, a hidden agenda that went far beyond the petty grievances of neighborhood aesthetics. Late one stormy evening, as rain battered against the windows and the sound of distant thunder underscored the tension in the air, she uncovered a dusty, long-forgotten map tucked away in the city archives. This wasn't just any map. It detailed a planned highway expansion that would irrevocably alter the very fabric of the community. Every line, every annotation on that faded document pointed to a sinister collaboration between the HOA and powerful real estate developers. Her property, with its irreplaceable history and unique charm, was not merely an outlier. It was a keystone in a multi-million-dollar scheme designed to force out anyone unwilling to conform. As she meticulously compared the map with recent zoning changes and clandestine meeting minutes she had obtained from former board members, the full extent of conspiracy crystallized before her eyes. The HOA's aggressive tactics, the intimidation, the staged acts of vandalism, even the arson that had reduced her home to ashes, were all calculated moves in a larger, ruthless plan. The plan was simple yet horrifying. Eliminate the non-conforming elements of the neighborhood to pave the way for a sterile, profit-driven redevelopment that would erase decades of history and community spirit. Each revelation was a piercing blow, yet it only fueled her determination further. With a steady hand and a clear mind, she began to assemble the final pieces of the puzzle, a mosaic of emails, financial records, and damning testimonies from insiders who had once been complicit. As the hidden agenda unraveled, it became painfully clear that this was not an isolated incident, but a systemic assault on the very notion of heritage and individuality. Her home was a catalyst, the spark that ignited a battle against a tide of corporate greed and bureaucratic collusion. Standing before the evidence, she felt both the weight of sorrow for what had been lost and the invigorating promise of a future where truth would prevail. In that charged moment, she understood that her struggle was not just for a single home, but for the soul of the community, a community that had been starved of its history and silenced by the relentless march of profit. And as she prepared to take her case to the highest echelons of justice, every fiber of her being resonated with solemn promise. that no matter how deeply buried the corruption, the truth would always find its way to the surface. In the wake of her relentless investigation, the quiet murmur of discontent in the neighborhood transformed into a battle cry for justice. Determined to expose the corrupt underpinnings of the HOA, she began to systematically dismantle the network that had terrorized her and her neighbors. With every new piece of evidence meticulously gathered, her resolve crystallized into a plan as audacious as it was righteous. She reached out to trusted allies, a seasoned investigative journalist with a knack for uncovering hidden truths, a former law enforcement officer whose integrity had never wavered, and community elders who remembered a time when neighbors stood together against injustice. Together, they planned a coordinated takedown that would shatter the veneer of respectability the HOA had long maintained. Late into many sleepless nights, they pored over financial records, confidential emails, and covert recordings. Every document and whispered testimony was a weapon in their arsenal. The quiet tapping of keyboard keys in her study became the soundtrack to her uprising as she compiled damning evidence of bribery, deceit, and orchestrated vandalism. Every detail pointed to a single unassailable conclusion. The HOA was not about community or safety. It was about profit and control, built on a foundation of lies and exploitation. With unwavering determination, she organized clandestine meetings with other wronged homeowners, each of whom had suffered in silence until now. The network of resistance grew exponentially, fueled by shared stories of loss and betrayal. As the first coordinated press release hit the local news, the truth began to spread like wildfire through the once quiet streets. Neighbors who had once cowered behind closed curtains now stepped forward, emboldened by her courage and the clarity of the evidence. The takedown was not a moment of vengeance. It was a carefully orchestrated reclaiming of dignity, a statement that the forces of corruption would no longer operate unchecked. As she watched the dominoes start to fall, every phone call to a journalist, every meeting with a former insider, and every handwritten note of testimony added weight to the movement. The momentum was palpable, a clarion call to every resident that their voices, once silenced by fear, could now be heard. In that charged moment, as the first concrete actions were set in motion against the tyrants of the HOA, she realized that the battle for justice had truly begun. It was a fight for the soul of the neighborhood, a challenge to the very notion that money and power could dictate the terms of community life. The battle lines were drawn, and there was no turning back. The day of reckoning arrived in the austere setting of the courtroom, a venue steeped in tradition, where the scales of justice were meant to balance truth against deceit. As she entered the chamber, the air was thick with tension and anticipation. The gallery was filled with familiar faces. Neighbors who had once whispered in fear now gathered to witness the fall of the corrupt regime. Every detail had been meticulously prepared, every piece of evidence laid out like a roadmap, leading inexorably to the truth. The courtroom transformed into a stage for a grand performance of accountability. With a calm yet resolute voice, she presented the damning evidence, a montage of financial records, security camera footage, and damning witness testimonies that unraveled the carefully constructed facade of the HOA. Each exhibit, each document, resonated like a blow against the empire of lies. The testimony of former board members, coerced into silence by threats and fear, was heard for the first time, their voices trembling with the release of long-held anguish. Even the once impenetrable veneer of the HOA president's confidence began to crack under the weight of undeniable facts. The defense tried to spin tales of misguided intentions and bureaucratic errors, but every word they uttered was countered by the relentless logic of evidence and the unwavering determination of the community, united in its quest for justice. As the proceedings unfolded, the courtroom transformed from a battleground of legal maneuvering into a public forum for the voicing of long-suppressed truths. Her words, measured yet infused with undeniable passion, struck at the heart of the corruption that had festered for so long. Each rebuttal and cross-examination peeled back layers of deception, revealing the raw human cost of greed and unchecked authority. The atmosphere was electric, a palpable shift from fear to empowerment, from silence to a collective roar for accountability. As the judge's gavel finally fell, marking the end of the trial, the verdict was not just a legal decision. It was symbolic exorcism of the oppressive forces that had long held sway over the community. In that solemn moment, as the guilty were held accountable for their crimes against innocent homeowners, the message was unequivocal. Injustice, no matter how deeply entrenched, would no longer be tolerated. The courtroom reckoning was a testament to the power of truth, the resilience of the human spirit, and the belief that every person, regardless of their station, deserved to live with dignity and respect. In the aftermath of the courtroom victory, the neighborhood began to stir with a newfound sense of hope and possibility, a renaissance of community spirit that had been all but extinguished under the oppressive rule of the HOA. What was once a landscape marred by uniformity and fear slowly transformed into a tapestry of revival and collaboration. Neighbors who had long been isolated by intimidation came together to rebuild not just their homes, but the very fabric of their shared lives. The destruction wrought by the corrupt regime had left scars, but it had also sown the seeds of resilience and unity. Together, they organized town hall meetings, community workshops, and celebratory block parties that echoed with laughter, music, and the clamor of collective effort. Gardens once ravaged by chemical sabotage were replanted with the care of 100 tender hands, each bloom a defiant symbol of renewal and hope. The streets, once patrolled by enforcers of draconian code, became avenues of artistic expression, where murals commemorated the struggle for justice and the triumph of the human spirit over oppression. In these communal gatherings, every shared story, every tear, and every smile forged an unbreakable bond among the residents. The rebirth of the community was more than just a reconstruction of buildings. It was a reclamation of identity, history, and pride. As new leaders emerged from within the ranks of those who had once lived in fear, they championed a vision of a community governed not by arbitrary rules imposed from above, but by the collective will of its people. Volunteer groups took on the task of restoring historic landmarks and public spaces, breathing new life into areas that had once been overshadowed by the specter of corruption. Local businesses flourished, spurred on by the reinvigorated optimism of a community that had rediscovered its strength and unity. The shared hardship had become the crucible in which a more compassionate, resilient, and inclusive neighborhood was forged. It was a living, breathing testament to the idea that even in the darkest of times, when the very foundations of life seem to crumble, the human spirit has the power to rebuild, to heal, and to transform pain into progress. The rebirth of the community was not just a return to what once was. It was a creation of something far greater, a future defined by collaboration, respect, and a deep, abiding commitment to protecting the legacy of those who came before. I end the final, reflective moments of her long and arduous journey. The lesson that resonated most deeply was one of true justice. A justice that transcended mere revenge and embraced the transformative power of rebuilding. Standing amid the ruins of her past and the promise of a renewed future, she realized that her struggle had never been about settling scores. It was about reclaiming dignity, about honoring the memories of those who had labored to build something enduring, and about restoring the moral balance in a world too often skewed by greed and unchecked power. As the community celebrated its newfound freedom with heartfelt gatherings and quiet moments of reflection, she took solace in the small victories. A neighbor's smile, a restored historic marker, the soft murmur of life returning to the streets once shadowed by fear. Her personal losses, the charred remnants of her home, the irreplaceable relics of her family's legacy, remained etched in her heart, but they had evolved into powerful symbols of resilience. Each scar was a reminder that even when the world seemed intent on erasing history, the truth had a way of rising from the ashes, stronger and more radiant than before. She dedicated herself to ensuring that the lessons learned from this tumultuous period would guide the future. Through community education initiatives, public forums, and ongoing legal oversight, she helped to establish a framework that prioritized accountability, transparency, and compassion over conformity and control. In her quiet moments, as she sat on her rebuilt porch watching the sunrise and sipping her coffee, she reflected on the profound transformation that had taken place. The journey had been fraught with pain and loss, yet it ultimately led to a deeper understanding of what it meant to fight for justice. It was not about vengeance or retribution, but about the courage to stand up for what was right, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. This philosophy of justice, not revenge, became the guiding light for the community, a mantra that reminded everyone that true strength lay in unity, empathy, and an unwavering commitment to the truth. As she gazed out over the revitalized neighborhood, a mosaic of restored homes, blooming gardens, and renewed hope, she knew that the battle had changed something fundamental. Not only had it dismantled the corrupt system, but it also rekindled the very spirit of community, proving that when people come together for a common cause, justice will always find a way to prevail.